Chapter 5, The Fairest Possible Start, the National Convention. On December 11th, 1945, Dominion Secretary Lloyd Addison, with Canadian approval, read his statement about the National Convention in Newfoundland to the House of Lords. Governor Humphrey Whalen then announced it to the people of Newfoundland. Canadian High Commissioner Scott MacDonald immediately reported local reactions to Ottawa. Confidential. There was considerable excitement in St. John's yesterday when the announcement was made over the local radio that the United Kingdom government was about to make its long-deferred statement on the future government of Newfoundland. The statement itself was listened to with great attention by all classes of people, and is, of course, the one topic of conversation this morning. The governor tells me that he has consulted 6 of the leading men on Water Street. They were rather alarmed at the prospect opened up by the British statement and were inclined to take the view that Britain had let them down. The reference to Britain's inability to continue to help them financially has of course not escaped them, and they seemed quite ready to draw the necessary interferences. The National Convention proposed by Lord Addison was based on a proposal put to the War Cabinet by A.P. Herbert after the Goodwill Mission to Newfoundland in 1943. The Dominion's office and Lord Addison had, however, made 2 fundamental changes in the wording of the terms of reference, which would enable the UK government to override the Newfoundland Convention and do exactly as it wished. Herbert's proposal had suggested that a national convention should be set up after the war and empowered to discuss and determine the form of government to be recommended both to the Newfoundland people and to the United Kingdom government. Lord Addison eliminated the words empowered and changed discussed and determine to consider and discuss. Newfoundland's elected delegates to the National Convention might discuss among themselves all they wanted, but they had no power to determine anything. All they could do was recommend to Lord Addison the course he should choose. In other words, the National Convention had the same authority to discuss and recommend as it did Governor Whalen to Alexander Clutterbuck, and certainly much less than Prime Minister Mackenzie King had to recommend to the Dominion's Secretary the course he should take. In his constitutional proposal for a national convention, Lord Addison had given himself every power and Newfoundland none. Not surprisingly, the statement was loudly condemned in Newfoundland. And there was another problem. What forms of government were the Newfoundland delegates to consider other than a return to self-government? What other possible form, plural, of government were being considered by Lord Addison and Prime Minister Attlee? Any halfway measure of representative government and union with the United Kingdom on the Northern Ireland model, with Newfoundland MPs sitting in the House of Parliament in London, had been ruled out. Union with the United States was not under consideration. What was left? A local monarchy or a dictatorship? As Attlee had suggested, the Newfoundland constitutional process was now open to various possibilities. Obviously, the only other form of government acceptable was Confederation with Canada. The unceded British options was implicit in the terms of reference for the National Convention, and the door left open for the Dominion's Secretary to act on it when the time came. The announcement of the National Convention was greeted in Newfoundland with the full range of emotions, from joy to anger. The people had waited a long time for any developments on the constitutional front, and the fact that action was finally at hand was itself a cause for relief. At the same time, the potential problems presented by this National Convention and its deliberately vague terms of reference were immediately apparent to serious and thoughtful people who, along with the general population, were soon plunged into a state of confusion and doubt. In the Daily News, Albert Perlin voted his Wayfarers column to the dilemma created by the Dominion's office. This is a fact-finding board we have to elect, and not a parliament of the people's representatives. How many realize this? Whose duty is it to see that this fact is recognized? The convention has not the power to decide. It has power only to recommend, and there is genuine uncertainty as to its legal right to recommend in view of the limited choices set by the Abreu report, the Joint Address, the Newfoundland Act, and the letters patent, and yet the convention is to be asked to recommend for inclusion on a ballot paper any form of government it may desire, regardless of the restrictions imposed by the only relevant document. For the language of the letters patent and all the documents on which they are bound is that when the island is again self-supporting and on request of the people, self-government shall be restored. As for the convention, it may study documents, it may debate them, it may turn itself into an investigating committee with the commission government as its victim. It may divide on one very point and become a platform for demagogues. It may become a center of operations for pressure groups. It may elevate itself into a parliament and imagine it has parliamentary prerogatives. But whatever it does or does not, it has power only to recommend the choices to be placed on the referendum ballot paper, and even its right of full freedom in this connection is suspect. In the final analysis, it can recommend what it likes, and the Dominion's office may throw out all its recommendations. 2 years previous, after the return of the Goodwill Mission to London in 1943, Paul Evans, the Parliamentary Undersecretary for Dominion Affairs, had assured the House of Commons that the Dominion's office was committed to take steps to ascertain what mechanically would be most acceptable to Newfoundland's public opinion. This promise was not honored, and it is doubtful there was ever any intention of doing so. The Dominion's office was well informed by its agents on the island, and officials there knew that the machinery now proposed of a national convention was almost wholly aberrant to Newfoundland public opinion. They decided to establish it anyways and brazen it out, as they would do in Newfoundland at other critical moments. The promise made in the British Parliament to consult the people of Newfoundland was meant for British public opinion alone. So while one thing could be promised in the House of Parliament in London, the opposite would be delivered in St. John's. This dichotomy was possible in part because of the British Parliament traditional reluctance to interfere in the Dominion's office management of imperial affairs. As Robert Holland states, the desire to keep imperial and colonial issues out of the parliamentary arena was to be a consistent feature of official British psychology in decolonization. James Maxton, leader of the Independent Labour Party, called the Commission of Government in Newfoundland the biggest blot on the British democratic system, a statement that was not challenged by the House. MPs were generally relieved by Lord Addison's statement announcing the National Convention. They failed, however, to examine the fine print, where they would have discovered that this new constitutional creation was just as undemocratic as the Commission. It was not lost on Perlin and other commentators that the elaborate window dressing of the National Convention was merely a framework for the entrance of Confederation onto the constitutional stage. Two sound views on the political situation have been expressed by Mr. C.E. Hunt and Mr. A.M. Fraser in papers read to the university's Women's Club. Neither can be accused of political prejudice, and their opinions on the issue of Confederation are a refreshing counterblast to those who would railroad the people into a course they might afterwards regret they had not explored in detail before taking the plunge. Mr. Hunt, apart from his general comment that there was no ground for defeatism, and that it was difficult to see how negotiations for Confederation could be opened by the National Convention. Mr. Fraser emphasized that the decision to confederate would be irrevocable and therefore necessitated patient and conscious expert discussions and considerations. He said also that he thought union, if it were desired, would have to be sought under a sovereign government of our own choosing. These are sound views. They oppose nothing. They condemn nothing. They merely point out the gravity of the course we would follow in considering Confederation, and indicate that their belief that only a sovereign government of the people should conduct negotiations of so far-reaching and delicate a character. C.E. Hunt was one of the most highly regarded men in Newfoundland, a brilliant businessman and scholar, dedicated to Newfoundland, but he was not permitted to serve on the National Convention because he did not meet the new residency requirements. A 2-year residency requirement for eligibility for election to office had been a pet condition of Governor Whelan, even before the Goodwill Mission in 1943. When A.P. Herbert had discussed the possibility of an elected convention with the governor in St. John's, Lord Addison had agreed with Whelan that this requirement would suffice to secure the election of candidates who were genuinely residents of their various districts and would effectively prevent the planting out of agents. With a view to their election by business or other interests in St. John's or elsewhere, the British were determined that Water Street merchants, mostly anti-Confederates, or their lawyers would not dominate any elected body and control political events in Newfoundland. The principal people representing rural districts in Newfoundland, even if they were from the district, often had their main residence in St. John's. There had never been a residency requirement in Newfoundland elections before the National Convention, and the result of its implications in 1946 was to deprive the convention of many qualified candidates. Major Peter Cashin also failed to qualify for the residency requirement because he had lived in Montreal for several years. But in Cashin's case, Whelan made an exception for fear of riot. Cashin was a popular man, the son of a prominent political family, and a political personality in his own right. Cashin had been Minister of Finance in the Squier's government until he accused the Prime Minister of falsifying minutes in Council and embezzling public money in 1929 and crossed the floor. He immediately developed a reputation as the protector of the people's rights. He was one of the few to speak out against the establishment of the Commission of Government in 1933, though ironically his earlier actions had unintentionally led to the end of responsible government. Cashin, like Canada, however, shortly after the war's end, he returned to Newfoundland and gave a series of broadcasts in which he condemned the plan to establish a national convention as a violation of the terms of the Newfoundland Act. Any consideration of Confederation, Cashin insisted, was a matter of decision between Canada and an elected Newfoundland government. A fierce nationalist, Cashin became the spokesman for the responsible government. As factions developed out of the National Convention, these opinions brought him into immediate disfavor with Scott MacDonald. He appeared in many dispatches from the High Commissioner, who once described him as a rabid and not very sustainable character, although a few people with whom I have spoken regard him as an honest and outspoken champion of the common man. At the Dominion's office, Lord Addison declared himself satisfied that, with the safeguards mentioned in the National Convention, should give us the results we desire. Yet officially, the department was at pains to make clear to Newfoundland and the British Parliament that it had no particular result in mind for the country. Such a preconceived outcome would be highly improper. The only men privy to the real agenda in St. John's were Governor Whelan and Scott MacDonald. The run-up to the election for the National Convention in June 1946 was a busy time for the new Canadian High Commissioner. Since his arrival in St. John's in 1944, Scott MacDonald had been exploiting the contacts made by his predecessor, Charles Bruchel, and reporting on his progress to Norman Robertson at the Department of External Affairs. He identified these people in his very private and confidential memo as pro-Confederation and listed some of them. Mr. Justice Dunfield, Mr. Cyril Fox, K.C., one of the leading barristers in St. John's, shortly, I believe, to be appointed a judge. J.B. McVoid, who has one of the largest law practices in St. John's. He says no hope for Newfoundland except in union with Canada, and is the lawyer for practically all the Water Street merchants, all of whom are bitterly opposed to Confederation. From that point of view, he might be considered as a possible member of the Commission. Chief Justice Horwood of the Supreme Court of Newfoundland. All these men are there. Others have expressed their views to me privately, but would not do so publicly at the present time, but certainly would do so if a commission were appointed to make an investigation. I will discuss this matter more fully with you when I see you in Ottawa. J.B. McVoy had article in Bruchel's law office in Halifax as a junior lawyer, and R.A. McKay, the special assistant to the Undersecretary of State for External Affairs, had been McAvoy's political science professor at Dalhousie Law School. McKay had already begun to court him, former pupil, in June 1945, looking for recruits to support Confederation in the coming campaign in the National Convention. McKay wrote about that visit. Top secret. Mr. McAvoy, a solicitor for most of the leading Water Street merchants, and apparently also for the Bowater Pulp and Paper Company. He is a forceful and effective public speaker among Newfoundland audiences. Mr. McAvoy, I should judge, has real capacity as an organizer and leader of a movement. He would, I think, be more than willing to take a stand and organize a group to lead a movement for federation. Mr. McAvoy hinted that he and his friends could find enough funds for a vigorous campaign in support of federation. The announcement of the coming National Convention created a dilemma for the people of Newfoundland. At that time, most of the people qualified to serve on such a body, whether they favored the Commission of Government, Responsible Government, or Confederation as the solution to Newfoundland's situation, believed that any step away from sovereignty, such as entering Confederation with Canada, would be taken only by a duly elected government representing the people of Newfoundland. This group included former High Commissioner Charlie Bruchel. Almost no one thought it correct or legitimate to include Confederation on the ballot paper of a referendum. All the major players, with the notable exception of the delegate from Bonavista, Joseph Smallwood, believed that the return of responsible government was a necessary first step to Confederation. But even beyond that condition, the majority believed that the institution of the National Convention itself, with its dubious terms of reference and lack of real power, was an unacceptable interference in the process and constituted an abrogation of the guarantee initially made to Newfoundland when their local legislature was suspended. To concerned Newfoundlanders such as C.E. Hunt, Albert Perlin, and many others on both sides of the Atlantic, Atlee's National Convention represented a fundamental breach of the Newfoundland Act of 1933, with its promise that as soon as the island's difficulties are overcome and the country is again self-supporting, responsible government, on request from the people of Newfoundland, would be restored. The wording of that document specified clearly that it was responsible government that would be restored, not representative or provincial or any other form of government, with the legislature in St. John's and all the sovereignty and power that had been suspended in 1933. The only flexibility the British had was in the timing of this restoration, for Newfoundlanders awaiting the fulfillment of a contract long overdue, terms that were once clear were now unclear, and what was once guaranteed responsible government had now become just another option. It is fair to say that in December 1945, Newfoundlanders felt the constitutional ground shift beneath their feet. The extent to which these constitutional and nationalistic concerns weighed on Newfoundlanders, even those most sympathetic to Confederation, was the first and greatest obstacle to the schemers in London and Ottawa. Their anxiety is revealed in Mackay's disingenuous reply to McAvoy's in February 1946. I was perturbed that you and your friends feel that the Constitutional Convention is the wrong procedure, and alarmed that you all seem unanimous against taking any part in it. I know it is rather galling to many Newfoundlanders to have the Dominion's office take such a patronizing course. The Canadians knew the device of the National Convention was not so much patronizing as paternalistic. I'll spell that one out. Paternalistic. And they were anxious, even desperate, for it to be accepted by Newfoundlanders as the conditional process. Mackay concluded his pitch to McAvoy with this plum: those who may show up as political leaders in the Constitutional Convention will in any probability be the leaders of Newfoundland under any new regime. The new regime could only be Confederation. For what other regime would Mackay be prompting on behalf of Canada's Department of External Affairs? No doubt promises and senatorships and other considerations of personal power moved some to accept the device of the National Convention. Everyone recognized, however, that Britain held the only legitimate constituted authority, and that those who did not participate in the process already established would deny themselves any say or influence in the future direction of their country. The National Convention, though deeply flawed, was the only option. Inevitably, then, prospective delegates were persuaded to participate. As things turned out, however, participation proved to be a strategic error. In Jim Halley's words, that spring, in May 1946, I was approached by J.B. McAvoy with an offer. The previous summer, I had worked in his law office as a student. Now he asked me to leave law school and come to work there full time. The governor, he said, wanted him on standby to run as a delegate for the National Convention. He would be busy with the convention and needed help to run the office. I knew that in McAvoy's office I would see everyone, all the major players, Gordon Bradley, Joey Smallwood, and the Confederates, Ches Crosby, Major Peter Cashin, champion of the responsible government, and the British Governor Gordon MacDonald, and the commissioners, and the agents for the British and the Canadian governments. I would have a front row seat for this historic constitutional event. It was an offer I could not refuse. So I said yes, and I saw it all. I saw the letters from Ottawa go across his desk from Mackay and others. I didn't read them, but I saw them. And his dealings with Smallwood. He knew what was going on, but we didn't think they could pull it off. We thought Newfoundland would defeat them and Confederation, but we were wrong. I was a spy in McAvoy's office, so I saw how it was done, and it wasn't done right. But we couldn't prove it then. We could not prove it. We could not prove that what George Hawkins had said to us that day was true until now. Now we can, because we have the top secret memoranda and other documents released by the Canadian Department of External Affairs and compiled by Paul Brittle. And what's not there, I can tell you. And I want to before I die. Perhaps the only delegate with downright enthusiasm for the National Convention was J.R. Smallwood, the member from Bonavista, who had run openly as an advocate of Confederation with Canada. Having been resident in Gander since 1943, he also met the 2-year residency requirement. Much has been said of this happy coincidence, with most scholars unwilling to take it at a more than face value. Smallwood's grandfather, David, had moved to Newfoundland from Prince Edward Island, where the family had been farmers for generations. Joy himself had a lifelong love of farming and a prejudice against the fishery, which was to prove unfortunate later in his career. He was born in Gambo, but immediately afterwards the family moved into St. John's, where he grew up. His father had acquired a bootmaking establishment on Water Street, and at the entrance of St. John's Harbor on the cliff's face, he had a giant boot affixed with the slogan, "Buy Smallwood Boots." It was the first thing fishermen saw as they entered the harbor. The business was a great success. Grandfather David became the center of young Joy's life. Smallwood's father, Charles, by contrast, was unreliable and an alcoholic, but with the help of his paternal uncle Fred, Joy Smallwood was educated with the privileged sons of the St. John's elite at Bishop Field's College. What little money he earned from working in the gardens belonging to his grandfather and other neighbors went to buy books and magazines, which he then rented out to classmates. He was a voracious reader, but always had trouble with math, short of stature and perpetual short of funds. Smallwood was an underdog at Fields, where he acquired an envious disdain for the affluent and ruling class. It was not in his nature to go unnoticed, however, and he led several student demonstrations. His most famous campaign was a strike against cafeteria food. The campaign slogan, "More treacle, less pudding." He lifted out of the British schoolboy comic book, and the age of 13, Joy was already showing signs of his grandfather's brilliance at advertising. When Smallwood left school at the age of 14, he had already determined that one day he would be Prime Minister of Newfoundland. After working for a time in the newspaper business, he left Newfoundland for New York, where he drew himself into the political life of the metropolis and felt the full force of the ideological undercurrents struggling for dominions in the world. He started as a journalist and then became a speaker for the Socialist Party. The climax of his New York political career was the election of 1924. The Socialist Party threw its support behind the Progressive Party, and Smallwood became a featured speaker. It was a remarkable education for him, but the party was annihilated at the polls. Smallwood returned to St. John's, a skillful public speaker and a committed socialist. His concerns for the working man and woman was genuine. However, a biographer, Richard Gwynne, states, Smallwood was never a socialist in the theoretical sense, but a populist, and an idealist by instinct, and a pragmatic politician and propagandist by nature. Back in St. John's, Smallwood served in the squire's government and learned a great deal from his mentor about the value of personal loyalty and party control. After the fall of responsible government, he became at different times a union organizer, cooperative organizer, journalist, and author, always with exceptional energy, zeal, and attention. All these qualities combined to make him famous across Newfoundland. In his next incarnation as the buoyant host of the Barrelman, a popular radio show, an engaging mix of Newfoundland history, song, and stories, plus mail from listeners, and show The show made Smallwood some real money. Then, inexplicably, he abandoned his successful radio career in 1943, and by arrangements with the British and Canadian military, installed at Gander, established a large pig farm there to feed the growing number of wartime personnel at both bases. Smallwood was certainly attracted to farming or husbandry, and already had an unsuccessful pig farm outside St. John's on Kentmount Road, which he financed with his earnings from the Barrelman. Some historians have concluded that the move was the spontaneous act of a lifelong lover of pigs. But even Harold Horwood, his fellow Confederate and biographer, allowed that by all rules of common sense, Joy should have stayed with the Barrelmen until he was ready to step out into politics, but common sense was not his strongest point. However, that may be. Most commentators on Smallwood, whether for or against him, seem to agree on one point. The man was single-minded and driven in search of his destiny, and that destiny lay in politics, not in pig farming. Smallwood never wavered in that pursuit. The idea that Smallwood would leave St. John's, the center of all political activity, as well as a lucrative and high-profile broadcasting career, just before the big constitutional issue of Newfoundland political destiny were to be decided, is psychologically unconvincing, unless that move was part of some greater political strategy. Some writers have asserted that Smallwood could not possibly have known of the residency requirements for elections as early as 1943, but that is not necessarily the case, as Jim Haley recalled. Smallwood was a familiar in the office of Charlie Bruchel, the Canadian High Commissioner. We saw him going in and out all the time. I say we, but I mean Grace Sparks, who lived across the street from Bruchel on Circular Road and watched Joey going back and forth there. Grace worked for the Responsible Government League later on and went around the island campaigning for the League during the referendum, so we presume Joey was Bruchel's man, or one of them. And of course, Bruchel talked with Governor Whalen regularly. Bruchel knew about Whalen's insistence on a resident requirement for any elections, and he knew about the idea of national convention since at least the summer of 1943. But whether there was to be a national convention or some other elected body, there was going to be a residency requirement because Whalen was insisting on that to break the hold of the Water Street merchants and their lawyers over Newfoundland politics. There was a clash of elites there between the British and the locals. The Canadians wanted the same things as Whalen. Like the British, they blamed the Water Street merchants for all of Newfoundland's problems, especially for keeping Newfoundland out of Confederation in 1895. Joy would have known all that from Bruchel as a possible player on the Canadian team that Bruchel was putting together. He surely would have been given any relevant information such as a possible residency requirement for any coming local elections. Charlie Burchell set him out in Gander with the Canadian military and the British buying his pigs. It was a perfect match for Joe. He could kill two birds with one stone, and if the National Convention had been elected when it was originally scheduled in 45, then Joe would just have qualified. But the convention was postponed a year because the war in Europe dragged on, and so he had to wait it out in Gander for another year before he got back to town. The announcement for the election of the National Convention found Smallwood ideally situated outside anti-Confederate St. John's in the district of Buena Vista Center, where he was already well known for his union and co-op work, not to mention the barrelmen. He campaigned with his usual single-minded determination more fiercely than any other delegate. During his residency in Gander, he had become an expert on Canadian federalism, especially the benefits of the new social programs supported by Ottawa, and his campaign was an unabashed cry for Confederation. So far as Scott MacDonald and the Department of External Affairs were concerned, Smallwood was a valuable asset as a proselytizer and a salesman for Confederation, but not as the leader of the campaign. To them, he lacked the gravitas necessary for the role. They considered Gordon Bradley and the last leader of the Liberal Party in Newfoundland a more suitable candidate, and he personally distrusted Smallwood. In 1935, when he was the magistrate in Buena Vista, he had written to the Commission of Government. If the government has any intention of giving financial assistance to a cooperative movement in Buena Vista, and I heartily support the idea, both its policy and its funds should be wholly free from the control or even the influence of Mr. Smallwood. I think he might be quite useful as a propagandist to travel about the country teaching the idea of cooperation, but as a business executive he is hopeless. No resilience is to be placed upon him where steady work or sound judgment is required. He is not stable. Eventually, Bradley, McAvoy, and their friends were all persuaded to set aside their conditional scruples and stand for election. Smallwood had no such hesitation. On June 21st, 1946, 45 delegates were elected to the National Convention, which convened on September 11th that same year. Several weeks later, Albert Perlin gave this account of their progress. The National Convention is a hard-working body. Anyone aware of the immense amount of patient effort that is going into committee work will not need to be told that. Day after day, committees are meeting for hours, discussing the particular problems before them, seeking expert evidence that will help them to marshal a full array of facts to guide them in their ultimate decisions. They are working under handicap. There are no statistics worth very much. The Chadwick-Jones report summarized most of what there is The Chadwick-Jones report summarized most of what there is, and one had only to glance over the document to see what little existence in the way of reliable and basic information. It was though at the beginning that there would be a great volume of highly technical and detailed information, carefully prepared and submitted by the government. Nothing of the sort has happened. The convention's committees have no power to summon witnesses and have no funds out of which to retain counsel to assist in gathering and marshalling the facts produced by witnesses. The convention has none of these advantages or facilities. Nevertheless, it is expected to produce reports on the basis of which the destiny of the country may be decided. The thing is absurd. It was absurd from the beginning. One wonders if it were ever intended to be anything else. On October 28, exactly as Scott MacDonald had feared, Smallwood suddenly proposed that the convention send a fact-finding delegation to Ottawa. Resolved that the appropriate authorities be advised that the convention desires to inform the government of Canada of the convention's wishes to learn the government's attitude on the question of federal union with Canada, and further wishes to ascertain the terms and conditions on the basis of which the government of Canada considered that such a federal union might be effected. Smallwood accompanied his proposal with a passionate plea for Confederation in which he painted a very bleak picture of Newfoundland. The people view the future now with more dread than they felt a century ago. We live more poorly, more shabbily, more meanly. Our life is more of a struggle. Our struggle is tougher, more naked, more hopeless. We are so used to our railway and our coastal boats that we secretly see them. So used to our settlements and roads and homes and schools and hospitals and hotels and everything else that we do not even see their inadequacy, their backwardness, their seemingness. We can, of course, persist in isolation, a dot on the shore of North America. The funks of the North American continent shruggingly, vainly to support ourselves and our greatly expanded public service. By our isolation from the throbbing vitality and expansion of the continent, we have been left far behind by the march of the time, the sport of historic misfortune, the Cinderella of empire. Our choice now is to continue in blindly isolation or seize an opportunity that may beacon us to the wider horizons and the higher standards of unity with the progressive mainland of America. I insist that as a constituent part of the Canadian Federation, we should continue to be quite free to hold to our love of our own dear land. This characterization of Newfoundland and Newfoundlanders was so reminiscent of the hated Amerley Report of 1933 that is caused and unpopular in the convention. me read that again. This characterization of Newfoundland and Newfoundlanders was so reminiscent of the hated Amberley Report of 1933 that it caused an uproar in the convention. After a long and heated debate, the motion was deemed premature, and even those delegates who supported the idea in principle strove to distance themselves from Smallwood's prerogative comments about Newfoundland. Scott MacDonald was furious. The reason for premature introduction of motion to send a delegation to Ottawa was that Mr. Smallwood, without any good reason, became apprehensive that someone other than himself might get the publicity that would be attached to introducing such a motion, and rushed in with one of his own. There is no doubt that Smallwood's indiscreet action has dealt a heavy blow to the cause of Confederation here. The motion was deplorably ill-timed, being put forward before reporters had been received from various committees studying the economic and financial position of the country. It was tactlessly presented, for instead of merely setting forth desirability of securing information on what conditions Canada might be prepared to offer, he made an impassionate plea for Confederation, in the course of which he painted a very dark picture of Newfoundlanders and their position. Moreover, one of the oldest and most respected members, who is also president of the Fishermen's Union, collapsed while making protest against Smallwood's tactics, adding a dramatic touch to the opposition's stand. The commentary by Albert Perlin in the Daily News did little to calm the High Commissioner's anxieties. Mr. Smallwood has allowed his zeal to outrun his discretion, in defiance of the understanding that all delegates should work objectively towards the end the convention was set up to attain. He has buttonholed members and others for private lessons in the virtues of union with Canada. He has held meetings of groups of members at the Newfoundland Hotel to discourse them on the same subject. And what Mr. Harrington and Mr. Howlett said about promises of a free trip to Ottawa and a senatorship in the same city has been related by others with various on the original theme. Mr. Smallwood alleges he is the apparent victim of the conspiracy, but charges such as those made by Mr. Harrington and Mr. Howlett are not lightly made, and if Mr. Smallwood is the victim, it is of his own impatience. Major Peter Cashin declared that the convention had only two legitimate options to consider: responsible government or a constitution or a continuation of the Commission of Government. In his view, the convention might as well pass a resolution to get a delegation to go to Moscow and ask Joseph Stalin what kind of government or terms he would give us. In the end, Smallwood's resolution was defeated 29-17. However, on November 4th, Gordon Bradley introduced an amendment which stated that the convention had the right and authority to ask Canada its position on Newfoundland joining Confederation. The amendment passed, signaling that a delegation to Ottawa was merely postponed. Scott MacDonald was thereupon moved to qualify his initial condemnation of Smallwood in his next top-secret memo to Robertson. While Mr. Smallwood's initiative was clearly both premature and tactless, his failure has had the effect of bringing the Honourable Gordon Bradley and the group of which he is the leading spirit to take a public stand on the Confederation issue. The convention was off to a dramatic start. It was Kenneth Brown, the delegate from King's Cove and president of the Fishermen's Union, who collapsed during his impassioned condemnation of Smallwood's unpopular resolution. Shortly afterwards, on November 16th, Jude Cyril Fox, the chairman of the convention, died suddenly. At the request of the delegates, Fox was replaced by Gordon Bradley, who had the most parliamentary experience of them all in the old House of Assembly. He was the third pro-Confederate chairman of the convention, indicating that Scott MacDonald's highly organized team was already well out of the gate. Ottawa was shifting into high gear in its effort to take over Newfoundland. The Prime Minister Mackenzie King had put it in 1940 to O.D. Skelton at External Affairs. Increasing resources were now devoted to the project. The second political division at the department was already overseeing the Newfoundland operation under the leadership of Escott Reed. In the summer of 1946, King set up the Interdepartmental Committee on Canada-Newfoundland Relations. The committee consisted of senior government ministers and bureaucrats, with Louis St. Laurent, the new Secretary of State for External Affairs, as chairman. On November 7th, that same year, Lester Pearson, the new Undersecretary of State for External Affairs, prepared a top-secret memo for the committee which focused on the fundamental constitutional problem with the scheme to take over Newfoundland. A serious difficulty in dealing with the delegation from the Constitutional Convention would be that they could have no authority to negotiate terms of union, since they would not be representing a government. An offer from Canada to the delegation from the Constitutional Convention might, however, be misinterpreted in Newfoundland as indicating a strong desire on Canada's part to annex Newfoundland, and possibly as an attempt to take advantage of the present situation when Newfoundland has no responsible government which could negotiate terms. Taking advantage of the situation in Newfoundland was, however, exactly what some key officials in external affairs hoped to do. Pearson himself and others within the department did not approve of this approach, and instead favored negotiations with an elected Newfoundland government. This became the central problem that baffled and bothered almost everyone from Ottawa to St. John's to London who took the time to consider the situation. It was the subject of long discussion between Clutterbuck and Pearson in Ottawa as they grappled with the question of how the unavoidable negotiation process might work. Top secret. Sir Alexander asked if we had given thought to the question of procedure. Mr. Pearson said that we had Mr. Pearson said that we had, and that we wished to avoid a situation in which, on the other hand, a Newfoundland delegation would come to Canada making positive demands, which could only lead to an inappropriate sort of bargaining, or in which, on the other hand, we would present the Newfoundland delegation with a cut and dry offer which might give the impression that we are over anxious to bring them in. There is, he continued, the fundamental difficulty that a delegation from Newfoundland would not be representing a government and would have no power to negotiate. We might expect at least to be able to provide the Newfoundland delegation with the information which they would consider sufficient for the purpose of the convention. Sir Alexander said it was this part of the process which he himself found difficult to envisage very clearly. He said that in arranging for the establishment of the National Convention, the Dominion's office had felt that their only acceptable course was to set up machinery which would enable Newfoundland to determine its choice in accordance with the will of its people. In doing so, they did not lose sight of the possibility that Confederation might be one of the alternatives which the National Convention might wish to consider. They had found it impossible, however, to foresee all clearly how the issue might arise. He feels, he said, that it would be well to arrive at a definitely agreement terms as possible before the question is submitted to the people. However, he finds it difficult to see how this could be done unless the Commission of Government were brought into the discussion at some stage. Clearly, there were very serious constitutional problems, which, with the process being improvised by the British in Newfoundland. However, despite all the difficulties the situation presented for them and the Canadians, not to mention the disadvantages for Newfoundland, the UK government never once considered employing the constitutionally correct procedure. It resisted all calls to return Newfoundland to the pre-1934 constitutional status, and instead created the National Convention to facilitate the transfer of Newfoundland sovereignty to Canada. Now having constructed their constitutional golem, Clutterbucks and the British were at a loss just how to bring it to life to make it appear to negotiate. Political blocs began to form early in the National Convention, largely in response to Smallwood's passionate partisan appeal on behalf of Confederation. To counter the sudden formation of the Confederate bloc, the Responsible Government League was formed in December under the direction of F.M. O'Leary, a leading businessman and the sponsor of Smallwood's radio show, The Barrelmen. The League included many prominent Water Street merchants, the Bowrings, the Bairds, the Ayers, and professional men such as C.E. Hunt and Gordon Higgins. However, Major Peter Cashins, the spokesman for responsible government in the convention, was not at first among them. He was as much distrusted by his fellow responsible government supporters as Smallwood was by his Confederates. His melodramatic style and historics remind them of the old-style politics of the 1920s, from which they were trying to distance themselves. As the time drew close to the referendum, however, they were compelled to join forces against the growing Confederate threat. But such division did not make for a strong, coordinated campaign from the League. Following the defeat of his first motion of October 1946 to send a delegation to Ottawa, Smallwood organized a second resolution in early 1947, asking the governor to canvass Newfoundland's options on several fronts: possible economic ties with the United States, financial guarantees for responsible government, or the Commission of Government from Great Britain, and more details about their terms for union with Canada. He arranged his package requests with R.B. Job, an important fish merchant and a supporter of economic union with the United States. According to the deal between them, if Job supported Smallwood's request to go to Ottawa, then Smallwood would support Job's request to go to Washington. It seemed reasonable, but it was a trap set by Smallwood. Sir John Macdonald, the British governor, would allow inquiries to Ottawa, but not to Washington. Cashin and Malcolm Hallett, another delegate for responsible government, knew well what would happen, so they voted against the resolution. It passed anyways. The governor, as expected, then informed the convention that, as far as Job's proposal went, any overtures to the United States were a matter for negotiations between governments through regular diplomatic channels. The jurisdiction of the convention would extend only as far as Ottawa, where such negotiations might be as irregular as they could be. Both Smallwood and Scott Macdonald were naturally concerned about the formation of the Responsible Government League, and despite their initial disagreement about timing and tactics, they were closely allied at this point. It now seemed likely that the convention would form two delegations, sending one to London to ascertain British financial commitments, if any, to a responsible government, or to a continued commission of government, and the other to Ottawa to investigate the conditions that might be offered for Confederation with Canada. Both delegations were completely ignorant of the understandings, financial and otherwise, reached between the Canadians and British officials in October 1945. The strategic deployment of these two delegations was of the utmost concern to Prime Minister Mackenzie King and the Department of External Affairs, and on January 8, 1947, Macdonald sent a secret dispatch to King outlining his recent conversations with Smallwood. Secret. Sir, I have the honor to report that in conformity with your instructions. I had an informal conversation on my return from Canada last evening with the Honorable Gordon Bradley, KC Chairman of the National Convention, and with Mr. J.R. Smallwood, member for Bonavista Center, the advocate in the Convention of Confederation with Canada. Later in the evening, I had a further and more extended conversation with Mr. Smallwood. I suggested to him that from this point of view, there would be a good deal to be gained if the dispatch of delegation, assuming that the convention will agree to it, could be postponed for 3 or 4 months. Mr. Smallwood was disappointed, but apparently not very much surprised. He stated that he would use all his influence to prolong the present discussions and postpone raising the questions of sending a delegation into Canada. At the same time, he pointed out that the feelings among the members of the convention was very definitely in favor of pushing on and coming to conclusion. Some extensions might be secured by raising points that had not hitherto been recovered. He also agreed with my suggestion that the task of correlating the economic and financial information contained in the various reports was a very important and intricate one and might well keep the discussion going in the convention until perhaps the beginning of March, though that would be the best that could be hoped for in the circumstances. A resolution might then be put forward that an inquiry be addressed to the government of the United Kingdom to ascertain whether, and if so, to what extent, that government might be prepared to continue to make itself responsible for the finances of Newfoundland in the event that the country retained the commission form of government, or alternately adopted responsible government. If it could be arranged that nothing be done pending a decision on this basic question, a further period could be gained, and perhaps the matter of sending a delegation to Ottawa postponed till after Easter. He did, however, feel that it would be most difficult to keep members of the convention from forcing the pace and coming to definite decisions before that date. And in this, I must say that knowing something of the present feeling of the members, I share his apprehension. If Smallwood was not taking his marching orders from Charles Burchell, Canada's High Commissioner in 1943, he certainly was from Scott MacDonald at the beginning of 1947. This incident of Canadian attempts to manipulate the agenda of the Newfoundland National Convention is noteworthy because of its success. MacDonald and the Canadians wanted the delegations to go to London first to gain Ottawa more time, and a nervous MacDonald sent this note to Lester Pearson in Ottawa, who relayed it to Robertson in London. The important thing at this stage is that the United Kingdom government agreed to receive a delegation and not head them off by an offer to reply any questions by correspondence. Anything that could be done to ensure this result would be worthwhile. MacDonald had a reason for alarm. Eric Machin at the Dominion's office and Alexander Clutterbuck, the British High Commissioner in Ottawa, did not want any delegation from Newfoundland in London at all. Now that Britain had run away from its responsibility and had nothing for Newfoundland in the way of support. It had withdrawn psychologically as well, causing a complete turnaround in attitude at Whitehall. On March 4th, 1947, Norman Robertson, now the Canadian High Commissioner in London, wrote to Pearson regarding his conversation with Machen. The Dominion's office feared that the presence of a Newfoundland delegation in London might provoke a demand from both sides of the House of Commons for assurance of assistance and support for Newfoundland comparable to the Colonial Development Fund scheme, which might be difficult to resist. For reasons such as these, Machen is inclined to argue that our ultimate interest might be better served in the delegation went first to Canada. Machen fully appreciates that his government will have to consider procedure in respect to Newfoundland development in close concert with ours and take Canadians' advice before determining what further instructions are to be given to the Governor of Newfoundland. Canadian advice was quick in coming. On March 13th, Macdonald sent this vehement telegram to Pearson. Immediate secret. The weakness in the program they advocate is that it disregards the fact of the situation. The decision of the National Convention taken on February 28th is that a delegation should go to the United Kingdom first to ascertain what financial and other assistance they may hope to receive in the future from the United Kingdom, and that no delegation shall go to Ottawa until delegation from the United Kingdom has returned and reported its findings to the Convention. The logic of the whole position is that the delegation go to the United Kingdom first, and in any case, any attempt to exercise pressure in the other direction would only defeat its object. Years or decades hence, a further opportunity may arise to bring Newfoundland into the Dominion, but it is not likely. For reasons I have outlined many times, the growth of further vested interest and development of Labrador, the increase of American influence, make union with Canada yearly more difficult. There is no likelihood that I can foresee of Canada and Newfoundland growing gradually closer together over the years, and in any case, Newfoundland could not be secure on more favorable terms later than it can now. In my view, the setting has been arranged in a way that gives us the greatest possible prospect of success, and nothing should be done to disturb it. Lord Addison ultimately accepted Scott Macdonald's advice. The Newfoundland Commission of Government, it seems, now had a Canadian commissioner in addition to the 3 British commissioners. 3 Newfoundland commissioners and the British governor. Smallwood, for his part, delayed the introduction of his resolution to send the delegation to Ottawa until March. After an assiduous examination of all committees' reports the week before February 28th, by prior arrangements, Malcolm Hallett had introduced a resolution to send a delegation to London. Both resolutions passed. On April 1st, 1947, Gordon Bradley, the chairman of the convention, read out Canada's reply to the convention's request to send a delegation to Ottawa. His Excellency, the Governor, has been informed by the High Commissioner for Canada and Newfoundland that the Canadian government will be happy to receive a delegation from the National Convention of Newfoundland at a mutually convenient date. The Canadian government is of the opinion that the questions to be discussed with the delegation are of such complexity and of such significance for both countries that it is essential to have a complete and comprehensive exchange of information and a full and careful argument by both parties of all issues involved so that an accurate appreciation of the position may be gained on each side. The Canadian government is confident that the friendship and cooperation which have marked the relations of our two countries should provide a firm basis for the discussions. The delegation from the National Convention will be warmly welcome in Ottawa. The following delegates were elected to constitute, with the chairman, the delegation that will proceed in due course to Ottawa: J. F. Higgins, T. G. W. Ashenborn, J. R. Smallwood, R. B. Job, Reverend Lester Bury, and C. H. Balaam. The fundamental problems presented by a Newfoundland delegation to Ottawa, the same issues that had to bedeviled Clutterbuck and Pearson, were immediately the subject of great concern in St. John's as well. Analyzing press reactions to Canada's acceptance of a Newfoundland delegation, Scott MacDonald noted with some discomfort. The Daily News says that it is evident from the terms of the reply that the Canadian government is prepared to treat the delegation as a body authorized to discuss in details all questions arising out of a possible political relationship between Newfoundland and Canada. This, it says, is an astonishing position. It expresses surprise that Canada, unlike the United Kingdom, in its reply to convention, sets no restrictions on the subjects to be discussed, asks for no specific topics, and requests no explanatory memoranda. The Evening Telegram was in favor of Confederation, and its opinion carried more weight but provided no more comfort for the Department of External Affairs. While it endorsed the idea of a delegation to Ottawa, it stated, "The term of such a union would have eventually to be determined by negotiations between the constituted governments of the two countries. The Canadian authorities must be credited with the elementary knowledge that any such issue as Confederation could only be discussed with a duly constituted government of Newfoundland." Although Gordon Bradley had already ruled the motion for a U.S. delegation out of order on May 22, 1947, D.I. Jackman, the president of the Wabana Mines Union, proposed to the convention that this national convention appoint a delegation of some 6 members or less forthwith to proceed to Washington, if and when arrangements can be made for general trade discussions and other relevant matters affecting the future economy of Newfoundland with the government of the United States of America. The convention passed the Jackman Resolution unanimously, but as Paul Bridle, now attached to the Canadian High Commissioner's office in St. John's, noted with unease, the Commission of Government has subsequently informed the Convention that it regards the conduct of trade discussions as beyond the scope of the Convention. The High Commissioner feels that the attitude of the Commission of Government in this matter, while altogether correct, will be regarded in many quarters as further evidence that there is a conspiracy afoot to shepherd Newfoundland into the Dominion of Canada. Jim Haley relates, I was the one who wrote up the proposal with Jackman at the Newfoundland Hotel, where most of the delegates were staying. Jackman, although a powerful and influential Union leader, was not literate. So I was there to draft it with him. He wanted the convention to put union with America on the ballot, and if not that, then at least to keep Confederation off. Jackson's resolution was passed unanimously by the convention. Joey supported it heartily, knowing that the governor, on orders from Whitehall, would say no, and that our request to talk to the U.S. was beyond the scope of the convention, but not the one to Ottawa. When the UK government set up National Convention, it sent Kenneth Wera out of St. John's as the constitutional expert to assist the delegates, whereas took exception to Governor MacDonald's ruling and advised that the convention did have the authority and jurisdiction to talk to the Americans. He was immediately recalled to London. Once it was determined that a delegation could go to London before the second delegation was sent to Ottawa, the Canadian officials had one lingering concern: that London should offer no hope of any financial or economic assistance to Newfoundland. There was much heated debate on this topic, especially in St. John's between Canadian High Commissioner Scott MacDonald and British Governor Gordon MacDonald. And this brings us to the end of Chapter 5. Thank you. It was a long one.